Okay, so we've started the recording. And first we're going to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And we also extend the respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. So I'd just like to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Dr. Andrew Kelly, who is the Manager of Learning Support at Edith Cowan University. His responsibilities in this role include Learning Advisor and HDR Student Support Programs, PASS, the Post-Entry Language Assessment, PELA, and Academic Integrity. And then we have Dr. Miriam Sullivan, who is the Team Leader of the Learning Advisors there at Edith Cowan University. Her research focuses on evaluation of teaching and science communication. And I'd also just like to say to everyone to please extend your acknowledgement of country to wherever you are in the chat box as well. Okay, all right, guys, I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Tiana. Good afternoon, folks. My name's Andrew. I'm the Manager for Learning Support at ECU, as Tiana mentioned. I'm presenting today with my colleague and fabulous team member, Miriam, about some of the research that we've been conducting this year. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge a few other people on this project that you can see on the screen here. So that's Tracy Ware, Kathleen Bolson, and Benedicta Santoso, who have also played really important roles in getting us to where we are right now in terms of sharing some of the data and the insights that we've collected so far. And also a thank you to the association itself for funding the research that we've been able to do so far. So following on from Tiana's acknowledgement of country, I'd also like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Miriam and I are presenting today from Noongar land in Western Australia. The image that you see on the screen is actually a painting by a local Noongar artist called Kaya Watt. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. A personal favourite of mine, so I thought I would share that with you all today. So in terms of an overview of what we'd like to walk through with you today, there's, I suppose, two elements that we'd really like to cover. There's a presentation piece, but during that process, we'd really encourage any comments, questions, reflections that you have in the chat. And as much as possible, Miriam and I will aim to respond to those as we go. I'd like to cover a few different things in that space, the context of ECU itself as an institution, its students, then an overview of the research that we've undertaken, and then start to unpack that in a bit more granular detail. So as I mentioned, first point, presentation focus, and then there'll be some time to break out into discussion groups and then bring it all together as a broader group to think about some of what we can take out of the research and the data that we've gleaned so far, and then think about how that might inform future practice, but also areas for potential future research as well. So to give you a bit of an overview for those of you that aren't based in Western Australia or from other institutions about ECU as an institution, so we've got a bit of a framing for our discussion today. I'd categorise ECU as probably a mid-sized university. We've got about 30,000 students across a few different campus locations in metropolitan Perth. We've got a campus in Bunbury in the southwest region of Western Australia. We also have a campus in Sri Lanka. And a few other locations around the world, and also a range of different online course options. It's a very highly diverse student cohort. We have high representation of mature age students. Growing proportion of our students are international students, growing numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as well. When we walk through some of the data, that will probably shine through as well. But important to reflect that that's the student cohort that we support and work with here at ECU. We've got a new city campus that we're very excited about, that you can see pictured here, scheduled for completion late 2025. Knock on wood that still meets its target, but we'll wait and see. A lot of the conversations that we've had around learning support provision in this space, though, align to some of the conversations that we'll have today in terms of student access and engagement with various types of support services. ECU itself, I would say, for the institutions that I've worked for, at least in my career, really positions student support and the student perspective really highly. And I think that's reflected in some of the results that we see through the Quilt survey. So it's, ECU is Australia's top public university for undergraduate experience, teaching quality, skills development, learning resources. And I think in some way that reflects in our strategic plan that literally the first listed goal and objective is about learning support. It's about study support and how we can personalise that over the next 5 years. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, and how we inform our practice here is really much a student-centred approach, and how we can support students as much as possible through their journey at ECU. Adding to that, I thought I'd just take a moment to sort of position how we frame our support services at ECU, and probably not too dissimilar from the experiences that you have in your institutions. At ECU, we really take a strengths-based growth perspective with the support that we try to provide to students. But we tend to prioritise and think some support is worth prioritising more than others. And you can see that reflecting in the graph in front of you. So our priority is always, wherever possible, try to embed communication skills development and learning support within the curriculum, and embed that as much as possible, because we certainly believe that that's where we can reach the largest number of students and have the most meaningful impact. But there's a range of different ways we can support students, and indeed we do on a regular basis. And that, again, is a sort of a key tenet of what we'll be talking about today in terms of having a comprehensive and a diverse range of different ways in which students can access support at ECU. For the purposes of today, though, hopefully this will work, we're really focusing on these steps. So we're looking at the learning advisor programs that we offer, our appointments and our workshops. We're looking at our PASS program, our peer-assisted study sessions, and we're looking at Studiosity as our third-party provider of online learning support. So that really is positioned in the middle of this graph here. And the reason I point that out is, while it's our focus today, it's not the only types of learning support we offer at ECU. So just to help frame our focus for the next few slides. Just take a few moments to mention some of the literature. Again, a lot of this, as language and learning practitioners, won't be unfamiliar to you, I'm sure. And the research that we've done so far has really been shaped to some extent by the current scholarship. What we've observed so far is some noticeable gaps in previous studies that explore university support in learning support in a university context across different formats, peer programs, services like Studiosity, learning advisor consultations, etc. Very few, if any, at least the ones that we've come across or been aware of, really try to look across multiple services alongside one another and think about the different types of students that engage with it and the reasons why, and to what extent we can determine impact. So they're the types of things that we were really interested in looking at as part of this research. Most, if not all of the ones on the screen here, again, not surprising. We know embedding support is one of the most sustainable and engaging ways that we can reach students. We know students who seek support tend to do better. We know that learning support reduces barriers to success for diverse student cohorts. And we know that the value of learning advisors contributes to improving things like student literacy and their ability to comprehend feedback. So as I mentioned, what we're really interested in is thinking about, in this context, which types of students are engaging in learning support. And of those students, which types of services are they choosing? And then, as secondary to that, to what extent could we determine impact, or can we build a link between their engagement with those services and its impact on student success, retention, and average marks, etc. So for the research questions that we explored, tied to what I've just outlined for you, there were really three that we aimed to focus on. So which types of students use learning support? So whether were they mature age students, were they school leavers, were they international students? We explored the demographic factors as well, and Miriam will talk about that in a moment. Then we started to look at, okay, of those that engage, which specific services were being used, both in a proportionate sense, like which was the most popular, but also were some particular student cohorts overrepresented in one service and less so in others. That's interesting for us because it determines the extent to which we can advertise, promote, and think about how we're providing that support and the impact that it might have for different cohorts, or its attractiveness, for lack of a better term. And then finally, what's the link? And particularly Kathleen and the project team has been instrumental in us looking at this. But I will say right now, it's a very difficult question to answer. And there are limitations that we need to share with each of you about what we learned going through this process, to the extent to which we can really determine a link between the use of these learning support services and what did that correlate to in terms of grades, in terms of success or fail rates and retention. So at this point, I'll hand over now to Miriam, who can really start to unpack the study itself and some of the data that we've collected so far in a bit more detail for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. So at ECU, we are so lucky that we have a single central database where all of the students' interactions with the university are collated. So we can look up a student and see what they've done, but we can also export that data and clean it up. So what we've done here is we've got 3 years worth of data, and that is 159,000 enrolment cases. So what we mean by enrolment case is a student in one semester or one half year block, what they did in that half year. So did they seek out learning support in that half year? So these 159,000 enrolment cases represent about 54,000 individual students. So some of them might be in several semesters, some of them might only be in one. And of those 159,000 enrolment cases, that includes over 16,000 cases of learning support within a semester. So within a semester, they could have engaged with more than one learning support, and that would count towards our 16,000. And that represents about 11,000 individual students. Apologies in advance, there is going to be a lot of numbers in this section, a lot of statistics. I was really excited about this data, but don't worry if you're like, oh, numbers, I'll try and explain it as clearly as possible. A couple of people asking what our system is. We use Salesforce. And look, it is really good. It's not perfect because it was made for businesses rather than universities. So we had a lot of struggles trying to get things like workshop attendance to go in. So that data is probably not perfect, but at the scale that we're looking at it, a lot of those minor errors kind of even out. So you can see we collected data on a whole lot of different things: age, gender, enrollment, the year. So we looked at it over time, things like their Pella scores, their weighted average marks, all these sorts of things. I'm not sure about Holly's question, Andrew. Is it a CRM? I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is.
Excellent. So we had a lot of data, and it was very overwhelming. ECU's had this data for a while, but it's actually so much that it's quite difficult to analyse. We were very fortunate to get a grant from AALL, and we used that grant to hire our statistics guru, Benedicta, who's a recent ECU PhD graduate, to come in and do a lot of the modelling and statistics work that we're going to talk about today. It doesn't, oh, there we go. Ah, Andrew, sorry, it doesn't like switching slides for me, thanks. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background on who is represented in this 159,000 use cases or 54,000 individuals. At ECU, as Andrew said, it's heavily mature age. So you can see only 10% of this cohort were school leavers. So it's very strongly weighted in that direction. Majority female, as you would see at your universities. We don't have a huge international cohort, and we did see that drop significantly in 2021 with the pandemic, as I'm sure most of our universities do. It's predominantly an undergraduate university, but the other 33% there does include postgraduate, PhD enabling, and also a small proportion of vet students as well. Although most of our students are on campus, we do have a pretty significant proportion there of online or mixed enrolment students, and that increased over the 3 years with COVID as well. And most of the students in the data set are continuing students. So while there are a lot of students, we really looked at commencing versus continuing, because as you'll see, that did become quite important in the data. So once we had all this data, we wanted to look at what these demographic factors, how they influence students' choices to engage with learning support. So to begin with, we're going to look at any learning support, which students engaged or didn't engage with any learning support. Sorry, Andrew, can you flick slide for me? Oh no, it went just a bit slow. Apologies, everyone. So to start off with, we can see that women slightly more likely to use learning support there than men. At ECU, students can nominate their, we do recognise that there are more than 2 genders, but with a lot of this data, if we had a group that was small, so for example, students who nominated their gender as being other than male or female, that is a relatively small cohort. So we didn't want to make statistical inferences from that, and also just in the interests of privacy. So I won't be talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students again either today, just for that same reason. It's a relatively small cohort, so the statistical power isn't quite there. But we see women slightly more likely to use learning support. We see that there's also a difference in age, so particularly those youth age students use less learning support, and international students use more learning support. So we're already seeing some differences in demographics coming out with who tends to come to learning support. Now, just to note, these percentages are within the cohort. So that, say with mature age, that 11.6% is 11.6% of mature age students. As we saw on the previous slide, mature age students make up most of our cohort. So actually most of the students we see through learning support are mature age, but representatively as a cohort, there's only 11.6% using learning support in any given semester. Next slide. And we also see there, we looked at some equity groups. I won't go through all of them, but here are some of, I think, the ones that had a more interesting difference. So we see that students who self-identify with a disability, slightly less likely to use learning support. First in family, slightly more likely. And non-English speaking background, Leslie's asked in the chat if we look at called. We don't necessarily call it called, but they do nominate when they enroll if they're from a non-English speaking background. So that's probably our closest grouping there. And you can see there that they are much more likely to use learning support, in that 23% of non-English speaking background are using learning support. So looking at all these differences in demographics and equity groups, we thought, this is great. We can see there's lots of differences. Let's build a model and see if we can get that model to predict who is going to use learning support so that we can then tailor our services. So we stuck this all into a bunch of statistical models and tried to make a prediction. And what we found was it didn't work. We can't predict who's going to use learning support. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first one is just our sample size. So on average, in any given semester, about 15% of students will use learning support. That means 85% of students don't use learning support in a given semester. So if the model just predicts that no one uses learning support, it's 85% correct, which is actually a pretty high rate of being correct for a statistical model. Now, we did a whole bunch of stuff to try and address that problem of sample size. We looked at subcohorts, we did matched pairs, and we still couldn't predict anything. And that was for a couple of reasons. First of all, if there's any stats nerds in the audience, as I was going through the past couple of slides, you may have noticed that the effect sizes were really small. So that, for example, means that although the p-value is detecting a difference between, say, men and women and how much they use learning support, the difference isn't that big. So when we look at it in the model, it's not particularly important or predictive. And then of course you have intersectionality with individual students as well. So maybe you are a male student, so you're on average less likely to use learning support, but you're also a mature age student who's more likely to use learning support, and first in family, so you're more likely. And it kind of all cancels each other out once we start trying to make these predictions at a population level. So on all those kind of demographic and equity factors, when we tried to model them, didn't really help us make any predictions. So although there are small differences, they're not very important or practical for our day-to-day running of learning support services. There were two things that did have a really strong influence. The first one is the school that they're enrolled in. So when we look at the schools, we saw that the biggest user of our services was UniPrep. So this is our pre-tertiary enabling program. I'm guessing a lot of you have a similar program. And so this is very comforting for us. We actually do want students in the enabling program to engage with learning support really early on. So the fact that they're our biggest users is really good. And then our second biggest was nursing. This is partly because of the demographics. We have a lot of women, a lot of mature age students in this cohort, but there's also a culture in nursing where they care about each other. So they have a very caring culture. These are students who are going into a helping profession. So we think they're probably a bit less shy about seeking out support. All the other schools are actually roughly pretty similar because they kind of change from semester to semester. So for example, here we see engineering's reasonably high, but it's gone down more recently. So those ones swap around a bit. And the lowest one, Whopper, if you haven't heard of Whopper, that's our performing arts course, which is very well known. Generally, these students who are working in performing arts or doing orchestral studies, they have less written assignments in particular, but it's also very, very competitive entry. So it's not surprising that they need a bit less support. So we're not particularly concerned about Whopper being a bit lower there. The other thing that was really important here was whether they were commencing students or continuing students. So this was really reassuring for us as well. Again, we want those new students to engage with us as soon as they start. Once they're ongoing, they're probably on the right track, we're going to see less of them. So that was quite good. And if you are into stats, you can see the phi here is much higher than on the other data that we looked at. This is considered a small to medium effect size in the literature. So this is good. A lot of people saying in the chat that it's similar. We're seeing nursing students are heavy users at other universities and enabling is as well. So that's very reassuring for us. Thank you. Excellent. So now that we've kind of looked at learning support as a whole, what I'm going to do is break down our individual services and we're going to try and compare them as much as possible. So first off, we have learning advisors, my team. And what we do is workshops, particularly focused at the beginning of semester, very much targeted at new students especially. And those are workshops on things like paraphrasing, structuring an assignment, understanding the assignment task, very generic. We do them online and face-to-face. And then we also have individual appointments throughout semester. They are open to all students. Workshops and individual appointments, we probably push them more at first year, but they're open to everyone. And again, individual appointments you can do online or in person, and we also offer phone appointments as well. So they're available to everyone. We then have PASS, peer-assisted study sessions. So these are more content-focused rather than generic skills. They're in specific first-year units that have really large cohorts. And we have PASS in about 22 units at ECU. Varies a little bit from semester to semester, but it's generally just over 20. I'm sure most of your universities have PASS or a similar peer study program. And then we have Studiosity. So this is fully online. Unlike PASS, it's available to everyone throughout their entire degree. Students can submit a sample of their writing and get written feedback, or they can also talk to someone in the live chat. So we tend to encourage students to use these for different things. When you first arrive, go to a workshop, sign up for a pass class if it's in one of your units. If you get stuck, you're having real trouble, you have academic misconduct, then come to an individual appointment. If you're reasonably confident, but you want a quick check or it's the middle of the night, use Studiosity. So in our mind, these support services are designed for very different purposes. But what I'm going to get you to do now is in the chat, I want you to predict how many students used all three. So of students that used learning support, so we're not looking at the whole cohort, but just the ones that use learning support, what percentage used all three services? So pop your predictions in the chat for me. Most? Oh, this is really interesting. We've got everything from 0 to most students, up over 70%, more than half. Now, this was actually a concern for us when we started this study. We were very concerned that a lot of students would, we'd have some students that would use all the supports, right? And this is something that we hear, I think, in learning advising quite a lot. So let's have a look at what we actually found. 2%. So 2% used all three. And we see that there's kind of some overlap more between learning advisors and Studiosity, bit of overlap between learning advisors and PASS, but it's very low across all three. Now, I'm going to show you a much scarier, this Venn diagram I think is quite neat. I'm going to show you a scarier Venn diagram. Brace yourself. I decided to break learning advisors up into individual and group workshops. And so when we break it up into the 4 services, we see that even less, 0.3% of students who use learning support used all 4 options. And around about 80% just pick one thing and they use that. So what we see in the data is this real pick and stick. They decide what learning support they use, and that's it. That's what they do for the rest of the semester. So even though we've kind of marketed these services as doing completely different things, that's not what's happening. Yeah, and as Georgina notes, it's really important to note that PASS isn't offered across the board. So we would expect to see less overlap with PASS, even noting that most students who use learning support are commencing students. So a lot of them will have access to PASS. But even other than PASS, we see things like if you used an individual appointment, we'd expect you to use Studiosity as well, but only 4.6% of students are using both. So it's quite low. It's also probably important to note here that, again, this is only our extracurricular support. So this isn't counting any of the other embedded stuff. Oh, so how are they choosing a support? That was our next question. And so we looked at some of those demographic factors again, but broke them down by the type of support. And there were a couple of really interesting patterns. The first one was age. So we see that mature age students and youth age students prefer individual appointments, and they're less likely to attend PASS, even when they're eligible. But we see that workshops and Studiosity, not much difference there. Students are pretty equally likely to attend those no matter what the age. And then we see as well, mature age students may be slightly likely to actually be those 20% of students who use a combination of supports. So there's certainly an age difference there. We suspect, now here I'm going to go into the world of hypothesizing. We have no data for this yet. And I'd be really interested to see your own speculation in the chat about why this happens. But our current thinking is that school leavers probably more comfortable being in a classroom environment like PASS. Mature age students have more constraints on their time, and they're probably also more used to, say, meeting with their managers one-on-one. They just want to book an individual appointment at a time that suits them, not wait for a class. The other big difference in use of services, if we go to the next slide, is with our international students. So our international students had a preference away from PASS. This is really disappointing for us because we push PASS really hard to international students. It has a really big impact on their grades, as we'll see in a minute. But also with international students, often they're looking to make friends, they're looking to meet their peers. PASS is a really good way to do that. Melissa has asked about the demographic of the PASS leaders. So they're students that have achieved a high mark in one of the previous years of the same unit. The demographic is very similar to that degree. So we do have a lot of PASS students who are PASS leaders who are international students, but for some reason, they don't want to come to PASS. We suspect this is to do with their comfort with English. So if they don't feel comfortable discussing in that group setting the content in English, but they might feel more comfortable, say, approaching a learning advisor or going to a workshop where there might be some interaction, but they don't need to talk non-stop. There's a question, do international students have alternative study groups? They do, and they do have alternative, not so much study groups, but socialization groups. So we have International Cafe, where they can go and meet other international students. And PASS is both online and face-to-face. So for all the units we have PASS, we run it in both modes. So that was quite disappointing to us, and we'll probably try to push PASS harder with international students. But yeah, that was disappointing. So then we want to look at impact. What is the impact of our services on students? And we found that there is quite a strong relationship between the number of learning support sessions and their weighted average mark across the year. So that's very comforting. It shows that students who attend learning support are getting better grades, and there does appear to be a dose-dependent relationship there. Now, again, this is across all 4 learning supports. I won't go through each one individually, particularly since this data, there's a lot of limitations to it. So here we haven't controlled for motivation. We've already seen most students in any given semester don't use learning support. So what's different with these students? It's probably something that university demographics don't measure, such as motivation or enthusiasm or sociality or something else. So we can't guarantee that this effect is due to our services. That could be due to anything. And because most students who use our services are commencing students, we're finding it quite difficult to split the data to only get students who haven't used it before and have a pre-existing WAM. So that's something that we're working on, but we'll have a quick look at the one for PASS, since that's what we were just talking about. You can see here the one for PASS is a bit steeper compared to learning services as a whole. So each of the services, we have a graph that looks quite similar to this, but there are slightly different patterns within the service. So you can see here PASS probably has the steepest curve in terms of it goes up the most with 5 sessions. Comparing them directly has been difficult because for some things like individual appointments, we encourage students not to use unlimited sessions, whereas with PASS, we encourage them to attend as many as possible. So the curve isn't as neat for all of these. And with workshops, we only run 5 different workshops, or 6. I think we have 6 different topics for the workshops. So it's not, yeah, it's there's a lot of complicating factors here that we're still digging into. Yeah, and as Georgina says, PASS is more content specific, so we would expect to see it have a bigger effect on students who attend. So hopefully in our future work, we will be able to talk about impact now, but there's so many limitations. We're still little, we're not going to discuss it fully today. But one thing I will say is when I saw the differences in groups who preferred different services, I thought, I wonder if these students know what they're doing. Like, are they picking the service that they know is the way they learn best? But here I popped in, we saw mature age students didn't like PASS. But here we can see that the mature age students that did use PASS, they end up with a higher WAM. If anything, the impact of PASS on a mature age student is slightly higher than it is for school leaver or youth age students. Not statistically significant, but it is a slightly higher percentage. So the students are probably not choosing the support based on the one that will help them learn best. Might be the one they think will help them learn best. But the data says it's probably not based on actual learning. It might be perceptions, or it could be something else like their level of comfort with the service. Yeah, so probably the one they're more comfortable with. So I'm going to hand back over to Andrew. Hopefully this has got a lot of discussion going and lots of thoughts going in people's heads.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks for everyone posting comments, questions in the chat. I can see it's really sparked a lot of conversations, and hopefully we can continue that into some breakout rooms. What we thought we'd do is pose some specific questions in relation to this, because in part, I'm interested to get your thoughts and your feedback, about what you've reflected on so far. So in the breakout rooms that we'll go into shortly, I've got 3 questions for you that hopefully you can discuss with your colleagues. The first was whether or not you thought the data that we've shared today would be similar at your institution. I think that would be interesting depending on your location, your demographic, your student demographic, the courses that you offer. I saw, for example, a lot of people posting that it was unsurprising that our nursing students here at ECU are quite engaged, because it sounds like that's similar at some of your institutions. But secondly, I think an important question is, what do we learn from this? What can we take away from it in terms of practical applications from the data that we've got here today, and what we can do on the ground to support students better, or how we advertise and engage with them. Second question is more about future directions. What questions in your mind still remain unanswered? Where can future research focus in terms of building upon this profile? So for example, my first thoughts are around getting some student feedback and student thoughts on their choices. Might be interesting to explore in a bit more detail. And then anything else that you might have observed, or any other reflections that you have. That would be really interesting to talk through with your colleagues. So I'll pause there. Tiana, can you assist us in now breaking out into rooms?
I am actually assisting, and just
Thanks,
let me
Alice.
know how much time you want, because I have to set that.
Sure, I think about 10, 15 minutes.
15?
Yeah, let's go 15, and then we can bring it back together as a broader group.
Oh no, people are leaving. Don't leave. I'm gonna have to reassign. Hold on, I have to recreate the room.
How about 10 minutes? Maybe 10 minutes seems less daunting.
Okay. 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Yeah, let's go 10 minutes.
With a 30-second notification. Okay. All right, I'm going to open the rooms now. If you're stuck in this room, haven't been assigned because you came in a little bit later, I will reassign you. Okay. We popped in. So speakers, Andrew and Miriam, do you want to join a breakout room or not?
I'm happy to, let's see how they populate and see where people have landed. There's a couple.
One room has only one person. So
Alice, I can join a room with, I think there was one with 2 people.
There's one with one.
Okay, I'm busy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm reassigning right now. Okay, so okay. Mary, you want to join? May, sorry, you want to join?
Join.
Which one was that?
Room 14. Shall I join
14?
Room 14?
Yeah, thanks. It's got 2 eyes on how many people, because I'm looking back and forth at which rooms and who to reassign. Room 12 now has 0, so I'm going to close that room. Any other rooms with less than?
I think everyone's got at least 3.
Okay,
yeah, that's good. 3 or 4. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
You guys are just here. Huh?
Yeah. I might pop in and out of a couple of rooms because
you can choose, right? Because you got your permission.
Yeah.
Okay.
I might also just broadcast maybe some of the questions.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure we can do that. So
sounds good.
broadcast message.
Sounds good.
So that's one. Do that one. Let's see if this one works. That one. And then Alice, if you want to maybe in like another 5 minutes broadcast the next question, so that what questions remain.
Actually,
I can.
Could you do that one, Tiana?
I can do that.
I'm keeping my eye on the numbers in the rooms.
That's fine. When I go into a room, it should let me do that.
Oh,
anyway,
you're okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that okay? Right. Sorry, I forgot you were going to a room.
All good.
Okay.
I will be back shortly.
Thank you.
Generic work and one-on-ones. There's Tiana. Hi, Tiana.
Hello.
And Miriam, whereabouts are you?
Oh, I can only see you.
There's a bit of
Rebecca,
work going
what's
outside,
going on?
so I'm muting myself when I'm not speaking. Sorry about that noise. I'm at ACU in Melbourne.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, so I can see everyone now. I could only see you, Rebecca.
Okay, no, there's 4 of us.
There's 4 of us
got
here. It. So we have a mix of what you described, Rebecca, the learning advisors and then senior learning advisors in each school. And is this similar for you guys in Miriam and Tiana?
No, I'm very jealous of the fact that Edith Cowan has 7 permanent learning advisors. That's really great for them. We're all casual at Adelaide University, so there's only there's 8 of us.
We count our lucky stars. Yes.
Yeah,
you're all casually employed.
It's a rough situation at Adelaide University. There's one full-time manager and then casual learning advisors, which I think it's impossible to do that job casually.
That's really tough. Yeah, you've got to have that continuity. Well, I don't need to tell you any of that. You know all this.
Yeah.
It's a tough gig, isn't it, Tiana?
Direct booking, we have direct booking links. So we use Calendly, and it enables us to have, one-on-one appointments with students who have, an access plan or certain disabilities. But the problem with that is that then you don't get to build up that relationship and rapport with other students who, use the service quite often, and students do get frustrated because they sometimes want to work with a certain learning advisor that they are matched with, and it's really helpful for them. And yes, they should be learning from other learning advisors too, because that's also helpful, but it's obviously becomes quite difficult. And then we don't get to help students with summer school as well. So
my gosh, so the system shuts down.
Yeah, no, we don't have work for 4 months.
It's a funding situation where it shuts down. The other thing too about Adelaide, which is really tricky, I've come from Adelaide and Tiana worked for me there, so speaking together. But the other really difficult thing is that it's very difficult to embed in courses when you're working with casual staff, because you're constantly having to calculate hours spent. Yeah.
It's all about relationships. It's all about relationships.
Yeah, totally.
People,
the retention of staff is amazing, isn't it?
Academics to decide, okay, I'm going to put the time into this because you're there and you're going to guarantee that this happens next semester.
That's right.
So it's maybe it's because of the profile of our university, whereas as you just saw, there's a lot of mature age students, first in family, and so on, that require the support. I don't know or how that came about. But
I had a conversation with a history lecturer from Adelaide University who I bumped into when I was having coffee, and she asked, "You're still working at the writing centre?" And I said yes. And she is getting frustrated as well, is that we're finding a lot of students are not being prepared adequately in high school. And then they're coming into the university system, and they're not then getting the support that they needed because the universities aren't giving the time and or funding, because we all know that all of our departments could be increased tenfold. If we spent just as much as we did on marketing into learning advising, and student support services, we would have a lot more students, they would have retention would be there. But I think the problem is that some universities, not all universities, more focused on, again, just sort of getting them in and not supporting them when they're in, only to the absolute bare minimum.
And the issue that's compounding that, of course, is the fact that we've now got students from the last 3 years of their high school education in a pandemic.
COVID.
And so that's going to, I can't see how it won't impact on that. Well, we're seeing it already. We see it with fatigue, with stress, etc. I'm very keen to see more research coming out documenting that. But you know, the impact of whatever demographic cohort you're in for this 3 years. You know, some people have done whole degrees, of course, but those school leavers. Miriam, what's your structure?
So we support all students, so we're general, but we've actually had a bit of a shift in that we're always sort of aligned with student services in that sort of area. And now we've moved into what's called the Centre for Innovation and Education and Innovation, a grand title. It was previously Learning and Teaching. So we're actually now in quite a different position in that we're working with other staff who talk a lot about learning and teaching. We're the only student-facing service in that area. So, but there's a great potential to work together to embed in a more sort of strategic and overarching sort of.
So is that a good move, do you think?
Well, in theory, it sounds great, the potential. It's still in its teething stage, I think.
Okay.
It's sort of, yeah, I think it can be really great, but everyone's trying hard to make it work. But it's just, there's a lot of institutional hurdles still at this point because the sort of restructure happened, but not all the sort of bits and pieces underneath. But I think potentially it would be good. I remember going to a conference, an all conference, and I think it was La Trobe had done a great presentation where they had, you know, the 3 pillars as we're now aligned with this potential to embed in sort of from the top. Haven't seen that happen yet, but yeah. But we had 3 questions.
We did have 3 questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go back,
And I was thinking about the data stuff, and I really like that Miriam was saying how impossible it is, how difficult it is, not impossible, but what a challenge it is to drill down and actually get meaningful data. You think about, I was thinking how interesting it would be to think about what question we really want answered. Like what question do we really, really want to know? Yeah.
And how would that help?
And how difficult to get that? And then how would that how would that inform us? What question do we have? And with that answer, how? And I guess that's the key question, isn't it? It can't just be this curiosity-based thing. It needs to be, what would we do with that information if we had it? That's the question. What information would inform us to act in certain ways? Like, how would you respond to that?
Because I work with education, I see a lot of, perhaps is a different proportion for me, of moms with young kids. And one practical implication of that is that we have set up, I know that they're very keen on evening support. I'm supposed to work 9 to 5, but we are very flexible with our timetables. So I can, and it's very popular for me to run workshops for Landtide or appointments even between 6 and 7 p.m. So I can't say that I do it very often, but once a week at least. And of course, but I can see that this works. But this was my sort of personal experience, seeing what, and with the support of the academics there, that also helped promote evening things. But you know, it's the ideal thing. The partner gets home, has the kid while mom tries to catch up with something. So
we're about to end.
A couple seconds, then we're out. Yep.
Oh, somebody's added the recording back. That's good.
There's never enough time.
So would we, Andrew and Miriam, would you like to spend, maybe we can open up discussion the next 10 minutes, just 10, 15 minutes, opening up discussion to everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. Are you going to facilitate that, Tiana, or do you want us to kick it off?
Yep, I think maybe let's kick it off with you two, and then if everyone can maybe pop their sort of, questions or comments in the chat box, and if you would like to speak, just say I would like to speak, and then we'll go in the chat box there and see how that works.
Yeah, not a problem. So let's start with the first question then. In terms of reflections on the similarity or lack of similarity potentially in the data that we presented with other people's institutions. And the second part of that question is practical applications. What can we take away from it? So happy to take questions, or if people want to share some, put questions in the chat and then we can respond to them one by one.
I'd be really interested to know as well if anyone else has looked at the data with overlap, because that people had a lot of different predictions. And I'm not really sure if that was based on your data or if just no one else has really looked at overlap much.
We have here at QUT, so we've got a university-wide rollout of Studiosity, but when we did our pilot to kind of assess the viability, that was one of the things that we looked at. So my guess was 5% when you asked, because we had it the same as you, very, very small amounts of overlap. And our kind of read on that was it was actually a good thing, because we were increasing the reach of our support and the degree of access to our support. So we were just happy that more students were getting to access the support on offer, even though there were probably better and more nuanced support for their particular situation. We were happy that it was just getting out, reaching more people.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. It's an interesting point you raise, because Studiosity is certainly not the first type of learning support we offer. We always try to, direct students to in-house support, because there's a bit more contextualized knowledge about the needs for those students. But, it's important to reflect as well that Studiosity has a role. It's reaching a demographic and a cohort of students that might not otherwise engage or be able to engage, particularly as all institutions explore more multimodal, multi-course location options. It does provide a way in which students can access support that they might otherwise have just chosen not to.
And thanks, Lynette, for your comment there about pass. Yeah, I agree. I think there is a lot of reasons they might not want to. And someone also asked about cross-promoting. Oh my gosh, we cross-promote so much. So this was quite frustrating for us. Like in pass, they are constantly referring students to Studiosity and learning advisors. In workshops, we tell them about all the other services. When they meet with us as a learning advisor, often we say, look, you're pretty strong. You probably won't need another appointment, but please come to drop-ins or come to this or come to that instead. So, and within classes as well, we cross-promote quite heavily our senior learning advisors when they're doing embedded stuff. So this was actually a little bit frustrating, the pick and stick, because it's like we put a lot of effort into promotion and cross-promotion, and that doesn't seem to influence their choice.
Yep. Same with Studiosity too. We provide some links, ECU specific support links to Studiosity that they are meant to share with our students at the end of consultations as well. But that, that works to varying degrees of success.
Interesting. Philip says that their uptake of Studiosity isn't as good, because that's actually our uptake of Studiosity, and Tracy might want to jump in here, is quite good, possibly more than we would like.
Yeah, I think one reflection that I have on Studiosity is that in line with some of the things that we've mentioned today, it's some students like Studiosity and that's all they'll engage in, so they use it probably more than they need to. And despite cross-promotion, despite to sort of redirect to other support services, they seem quite inclined to stick with Studiosity. So I would prefer we reach more students with Studiosity, but they engage with it less. But what we see in practice is probably a smaller cohort than we would have otherwise liked, but they engage in it quite a lot. What other questions do we have here? Miriam, did you want to respond to the question about popularity at different times of semester?
Yeah, it does vary a bit. So particularly with individual appointments, we find that they peak when first and second assignments are due. So we find as the first assignment is due, we have a big peak in individual appointments. And then we have another peak when they first get their grades back for their first assignment. With PASS, it actually has a peak at the end of semester. Like it's pretty consistent throughout, but we run a lot of super study sessions before exams. So we get a bit of a peak there. Studiosity kind of goes, you know, same thing, follows the semester, the number of assignments that are due. Workshops, we actually found there was no point running them after week 5. No one attends after week 5. So we only run our workshops for those quite intensively for kind of a week in the first 5 weeks of semester. We also we haven't included a lot of drop-in data here because we weren't reliably recording data necessarily the entire time that we were looking at this data. But we also now have daily drop-ins, and we see that fluctuation throughout the semester quite strongly in our drop-ins as well.
Happy to answer more questions in relation to the first one, but May, your question about planning focus groups and interviews leads itself well to the second question on the screen that maybe came up in the discussion in breakout rooms about, you know, remaining questions unanswered, future research. To my mind, that was the first thing we were thinking of once we thought of, okay, now we've got all this, what do we do next? Where can we build on this? And certainly gathering student feedback as to the reasons why students chose one particular service over the other. Were they even aware of the other services? What their perceived value was? Some of that we gather internally for internal reports. And that's something that we could think about doing more in future, I think, as well. But certainly, I think that's one of the obvious next steps. And we even had one example, I think, of Miriam, you might be able to speak to this more than I, about an academic staff member encouraging the engagement with learning support in relation to an assessment that we didn't know about.
I had a student come in for an individual appointment this semester, and they actually, part of the assignment was a reflection where they had to get learning support for this assignment. And then they had to reflect on, was the learning support helpful and why did you choose that particular support? So we happen to have all that data, and hopefully we can work with the unit coordinator and maybe get ethics. The particular student I was talking to was a mature age student. And I said, why did you pick an individual appointment? And they said, oh, I don't have time to be going to other things. I just want to meet one person and get my answer. So that was quite interesting because that kind of aligned with what we've been speculating about.
I'm just scrolling back to see if we've missed any questions.
Yeah, and same as Kate says, most of our advisors, we are a bit older, so it's not surprising mature age students potentially feel more comfortable. But having said that, a lot of our PASS leaders are mature age students as well, because they do get quite high grades, so we tend to recruit them. So that's reflected in our peers too. Yeah.
I might respond to David's comment because I think it's a really interesting one. That one observation that we've seen, particularly post-COVID, I imagine, because we start, you know, as a response to that, in part, we implemented ways in which students can get appointments online and did more workshops and drop-in sessions, etc., online. And we really see the attendance rate and students' preferences change, I think, over the last couple of years. I think, you know, while most of our students are enrolled in an on-campus course, at least half or around half of all of our appointments are conducted by Microsoft Teams now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Miriam, you might be more across the data than I.
It had settled at 40% were conducted by Microsoft Teams, but this year when COVID actually reached WA, we saw that go up to 50% because we had a lot of people switching the appointment to online at the last minute. And I agree with the feedback there too, that most students need learning support when they have their first assessment task feedback. Yeah, and we really encourage them to come in. And the other thing we do is a lot of the unit coordinators actually will put in the feedback, please go and see a learning advisor and discuss this. So that's really helpful as well.
Sorry, I put my hand up. I've got a question about that one, because for some of the units where we're talking to academics, by the time they get their assessment feedback, it's a bit too late to get a pass in the rest of the course for some of the students, especially postgraduate students. Are anyone in this session, any of your institutions, how do you deal with trying a strategy to push people to access the services before they get their feedback?
I'm just trying to think through that question. It's probably, we probably don't have a formalized way of doing it. Sometimes it just comes down to individual academics and students in terms of their proclivity to want to engage early. You know, I think sometimes it just comes down to individual choice and capacity to make the smart decision to engage earlier than not. I could also just, I suppose, add to that, I suppose, you know, right at the start, Tiana mentioned one of my responsibilities includes academic integrity. A common theme in that space is students who do start really, really late tend to not only do poorly in those assignments, but also quite often find themselves in academic integrity investigations, which is less than ideal. I can see, okay, Miriam, you responded to Ken in the chat. Alex, you had your hand up?
Yes, I mean, I know from having done surveys across several universities that many universities that conduct PLAS, post-enrollment language assessments, it's on the basis of that they kind of strongly or suggest to students, or sometimes they say it's compulsory to go and attend some workshops or go and see the learning, and that happens before assignments are due. So if a PLA is conducted in the first 2 weeks of semester, on the basis of the results of that, the universities can suggest to students to go and see learning advisors.
Thanks, Alex. Just having another look at the chat.
Yeah, just to jump in, I did just reply to Rebecca, but yeah, with individual appointments, that one's interesting because there are hard limits. We only have so many appointments, so they can only reach a certain number of students, and we do consistently book out. We do things like we put on triage appointments and save some space for referrals to make sure we're getting the most urgent appointments each semester. But yeah, there is actually a limit on appointment bookings. There are a lot of weeks over mid-semester break and stuff where we're not booked out, but there is that time period where we're consistently booked out every week. And I think that's probably quite common at unis. Ken asked what modelling we used. We did use regression modelling. Now, don't quote me on this because our stats guru isn't here and Benedict did the modelling for us. I believe we did look into some things like SPSS modeler that do machine learning, but given that our effect sizes were quite small and the results we were getting from the regression, it didn't look like we were going to get any more results from using other types of modelling. Yeah, and then with the Pella, we have looked at Pella data as well. We're still digging into that now, but essentially it kind of looks like because our Pella so far hasn't been mandated, students who choose not to do the Pella, that they do have kind of more issues than students who do choose to do the Pella, which again kind of links back to motivation. And it does affect their support services, but no huge effects, like nothing super noteworthy, but we are still digging into that and exploring it more.
Yeah, but the Pella is going to be compulsory from next semester, so where that should work, you know. We still can't, we're not mandating them to go to learning support though, so that'll be up to the lecturer, I guess, and maybe they can, you know, the best thing is if they can incorporate the Pella or the Pella results into what they're doing to say, compare this to how you're going, or, you know, actually actively promote it, the lecture is the best one to get students to go. That's what the research shows anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I can see that in the chat a lot too, that people are saying having a lecturer recommend people attend support is the most important thing. Having said that, there are a lot of students who don't attend support, but remember this data set is across the degree. So really say at third year, fourth year, we're not expecting the students to need that much learning support. They've already had a couple of successful years at university. So they should be largely independent by that point, unless they come across a unusual type of assignment or they get some particular feedback. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if students don't attend learning support, as long as it's because they're confident. It is a problem if they need it and they're not attending. And we do have a lot of recommendations, a lot of systems set up when students are failing to try and encourage them to attend as much learning support as possible.
Thanks, Miriam. If there's any other, just that the third question that we did pose was any other interesting observations or reflections. So before we move on to a conclusion slide and bring this session to a close, I just wondered if there's any other comments, any other questions, any other reflections people had about the session that Miriam and I could respond to.
Love that question about student-to-student and viral promotion. I really want to see the answer to that, because we've been thinking about that too. We don't have any answers yet.
One reflection I have is the increasing importance of thinking about peer learning support amongst the different types of support services that we offer, and how, you know, even in the past data that Miriam shared, it suggested to us, at least from my read of it, that it was having the strongest impact. And there's a number of reasons for that, of course, because it's, you know, aligned to assessments and curriculum. But there is a lot of value, I think, in thinking through the role of peers in supporting other students. And I think that's, you know, over the next few years, something that, you know, us as professionals in this space need to start thinking about what that looks like. Just looking through the chat. Yeah, Tracy mentions Studiosity's using videos now, speaking about how helpful Studiosity has been as well. So again, using peers to promote as well, not just in terms of the support, but I think the promotion piece as well is really critical.
Yeah. And thank you so much for everyone's feedback. It's been really interesting to see what other people have observed is the same or different at their universities.
Okay, so if there's no other questions, I might just go to the final slide and then hand back over to Tiana to wrap up the session. So just a few conclusions that Miriam and I put together and thinking about future directions, many of which we've already covered, but I think hopefully touch upon some of the key themes from your perspectives. We certainly saw from our observations of the data that it really did seem to be that students that do engage in learning support tended to choose a preference, again, pick and stick, rather than just use everything that's available. We saw that different student cohorts tended to choose different forms. But it's also important to acknowledge that there were limitations to the data set, unfortunately, but that's just the reality of working in research in this particular space, because most students enrolled at universities don't all go to PASS, they don't all have a learning advisor appointment. So it does make it a bit more difficult to determine those links between the use of learning support and student success metrics. But certainly in terms of opportunities, I think it provides useful insights, particularly into the degree in which they engage in one or more support services. Thinking through what that might mean in terms of future research, I think is really important too. Conducting focus groups, for example, gathering student feedback about their choice, perspectives, reflections on different support services that they engage with in the context of their academic skills and development as a student at university, I think is really important. So I think, you know, moving forward, that's something that we can build on. Right, I think that's it. Tiana, I might hand back over to you if you need to say anything to wrap up the session.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Miriam, for, you know, presenting this data. I think this is really important for everyone. I'm sure everyone will agree how great this has been, and this is really, you know, integral information that we need for, you know, our for student support services in general and for learning advisors. So the recording will be available probably within the next fortnight, and the slides along with it for those who would like to, you know, be able to reflect on this or show this to their colleagues who didn't get to attend today. And yes, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their afternoon or day. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Do you want us to stay, Tiana?
Yes, please. I'm just going to stop the